If you've got a founder who's grown to 5 or 10 million and they are the primary exclusive shareholder, they've been making all the big boys or big girls decisions, I will get asked, do we need governance? And so my response is very simple. If you own the business, if you're the director of the business, if you're the manager of the business, you don't need all of that formality, but there is some legal minimum, like you've got to put in a company's return and all that sort of stuff. If, however, you're looking to grow further, and or you don't necessarily want to make all the big decisions yourself, and or you lack some expertise to make good decisions, then it can be useful to get some other people around you, appoint them as directors, and then get the basics underway. And so the board's got to look after the best interests of the company. We know that, and the company shares are sitting in the room beside us. But actually there's this environment of trust and fiduciary, and how do we work together to make sure that we make good decisions so the company keeps going, because if the company keeps going, the shareholders win.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Ways to Wealth. Today I am joined by Peter Crow. Peter, why don't you give us the TLDR on who you are and what you're working on?
Thanks very much, Charlie. Great to be here, and I'm thrilled to serve as much as I can and share as much as I can. So Peter Crow, I'm called a governance expert by others. That doesn't sit comfortably with me at all. I'm just a guy who's all in on helping boards of directors, on scale-ups, on ambitious founder-led companies, on family businesses, private companies, helping them grow strong businesses, create wealth, and be successful and sustainable in the future. Been doing it for about 30 years.
That's amazing. It's an interesting thing to talk about, because if you've been in governance for 30 years, you would have seen a real transition of how governance has been done over the last 30 years. And people typically go into governance late in their career, but you've obviously spent, the majority of your career exploring, researching, understanding kind of the truth behind real governance in action.
It's interesting you say truth, because it makes the impression that there's a single way of doing it. So I'd like to sort of pop that balloon reasonably early. Where it all started was fascinating, because my first career had nothing to do with governance. It had nothing to do with group decision making. I'm a farm boy. And so I know about cows. I know about where the sun comes up and where it lands and all of that sort of stuff. But I was introduced to business and technology when I lived in America in the late 70s. And so my first career was software engineering, project leadership, and was fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of really interesting entrepreneurial projects through the 80s, sales marketing. And probably two conversations, one with an elderly man in about 2006.
Yep.
And then one with an academic in 2011, which really flipped me. But the genesis of it was probably a decade before, so that 30 years ago, from now, where my father sat me down and we were talking about boards of directors. Company director who was serving on his local dairy company board, but never mentioned the word governance. And so what do boards do? So a bit of a chat about that. I was green behind the ears, wet everywhere, but it got me fascinated as to what might sit on top of chief executives, how we might lead businesses, and this whole idea of making a decision as a group and having this wonderful legal thing called fiduciary responsibility. So we're playing with somebody else's money.
Yeah.
So all of that was in the mix, and that's what got me started. And it was in 2001 that I walked away from corporate life to sort of jump in the swimming pool. Because, when you jump in, all of you gets wet.
Yeah.
And so that started the journey. And coincidentally, it was at the time that this word governance was just breaking out from academia into the real world.
Right.
If you have a look at an annual report, for example, from, say, the 80s or the 90s, you won't find the word governance in it. You'll see a section called Board of Directors or Directorship, and they'll talk about stuff. Whereas if you look at modern day equivalent annual report, they've got a section called Governance, which is the same section, but we use different name. So there's this interesting dynamic that's gone through. And what I've noticed over the time is we've gone from boards of directors who perhaps cynically, meet together, eat their sandwiches, smoke their cigars, all of the old leather chairs,
There we are. Here we are.
Through to now a much stronger focus on this group of men and women actually driving company performance. And yet, unlike doctors and lawyers and software engineers and plumbers, we don't have to have any training. We can just come into the room, sign up to be a director, and suddenly we're experts. So that's the sort of playing field that we're dealing with. And if I can be a little bit bold, that's what also gets us into trouble, because we all think we're experts. And we've all got a different view, or not all of us got a different view, but there are many different views as to how to make this work well. So I find it fascinating because it's just a complex, emerging reality.
Okay, so you got into governance in 2001 and you come to the realization that, I guess, you're imbued with this responsibility, but it's actually hard to quantify if you're the right fit or even have the actual expertise to create the change that the organization needs.
Yep. And you don't necessarily know what governance is, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just come right fast forward to now, but projecting back. So over the last, say, 20 years, I get asked questions, as you'd expect, right? And I've got this mantle now which sits uncomfortably called global expert. Sometimes in Asia they call it world authority.
I think that's kind of cool. I don't know. It's a bit of a vibe.
I know. It's odd, isn't it? But we all bleed red, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just Peter Crow.
Yeah.
And the questions that I get asked are these. What is corporate governance? What is the role of the board? How should it be practiced? And how should this thing called a board work with this other thing called management?
Yeah.
Here's the fascinating thing. Those are the top 4 questions, well, the first 3, and then there's a bit of a gap for the 4th one, not quite as frequent, but let's just bundle them.
Yeah.
So they're the top 4 questions this year.
Yeah.
Last year.
Yeah.
They're the same top 4 questions as 20 or 30 years ago. So what that tells me is we're struggling to learn, we're struggling to understand what it is we're talking about. And that's kind of awkward.
Do you think it's like a framing, like, oh, well, we know and we've heard that this thing is important, so we're going to ask, oh, what is good governance, rather than maybe we should be asking, how do we govern this thing well?
Yes, but I think that first question, what is governance, what is good governance, I think that becomes a stumbling block, even a stone in your shoe for some people, because they might go off to X, an institution or a training place or something that says, well, governance is this.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what good looks like. And then they'll talk to me or you and say, and we'll give them a different answer. Then they'll talk to a third person and get a third answer. And we're all saying, this is what it is. And of course, the person is then saying, well, they can't all be right. And so they end up getting a little bit, and now they'll never admit it publicly because they're supposed to know what it is. But I get asked a lot, Peter, this institution, and it doesn't matter where it is around the world, so I'm not picking on any institution here in New Zealand, but this institution has said to me, this is best practice, this is what works. Can you tell us what actually works? Or I can tell you about some core principles that are universal, but the application of them is highly contextual. So what works for Air New Zealand, for Fletcher Building, for Fonterra, in terms of the way we do it, will be different from a high-tech startup or a founder-led business or an entrepreneurial scale-up, right?
Yeah.
But the underlying principles are the same.
Okay.
And they're the same in South Africa, New Zealand, China, or within reason China, but, in different parts of the world.
So I guess what are those principles then?
So the principles.
Yeah.
So there are 4. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
But I'm going to take you to the act, so the law. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
So our responsibility as directors, as board directors, is to ensure the performance of the company into the future. It's about that simple.
Yeah.
And the way we do that is we receive information, so we learn stuff about what's happening.
Yeah.
And we make decisions.
Yeah.
Simplistically.
Yes.
And there are 7 duties in law that we've got to do, right? So we're not going to go through those, but they're there.
Yes.
Right? So they're like your playing field.
Yeah.
But the principles are based on those. And so as a group, as a board of directors, We've got to take the company into the future. So there's a future dimension and a past dimension. And then there's stuff that happens inside our organisation, and then there's the marketplace stuff. So you can imagine it's sort of a 2x2.
Right.
So here are the 4 principles. We as a board need to set direction. So purpose, strategy, or North Star roadmap, if you want to use that language, right? So set direction. All businesses need to know where they're going.
Yeah.
And within reason, roughly how they're going to get there. Okay, that's first one. Second, capability. So not only set direction, but we've got to make sure we've got enough resources to make it happen. So leadership, culture, money, that we've got a sense of, are people going to buy our stuff, right? Now, we're not doing it, but we've got to ensure that all of that's there.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
Now,
can you make the widget,
Yeah, that's a bit down in detail, but certainly, have we got the resources? Have we got the right leadership structure? Have we got the money? That sort of culture, that sort of stuff, right?
Okay.
To deliver progress against that North Star, that roadmap, right? So they're the future-facing principles.
Yeah, right.
And then the sort of the now and past ones, we need to make sure we did what we said we'd do. So we need to hold management to account.
So that's number 3.
That's number 3.
Right.
And so that's sort of that internal rearward facing of overseeing performance.
Yeah.
So did we do what we said we would? Are we achieving what we hoped we would relative to strategy?
Yeah.
And are we within the law? Because we've got to comply, right? We can't just be cowboys.
Yeah.
And if I can just take an aside at that point, what becomes fascinating is a lot of us as directors are quite happy to spend a lot of our time in that area. A, because it's straightforward, either we did it or we didn't. B, compliance with the law is kind of important for matters like reputation.
For sure. Whether
we've got to put our hands in our pockets to pay a fine.
Yeah.
And we see and hear about failures in the press, don't we? And it's usually the 4th principle is all about accountability. It's not our money. It's the shareholders' money. So we've got to provide an account to shareholders in company terms and board terms. That's about the annual meeting, the annual report, however often we're going to keep them up to date. If we're a bit bigger business or in a regulated environment, banking, FMA, we've got to provide reports to the regulator to show them that we're in zone. If we're in a marketplace that's physically dangerous, say, I don't know, forestry, we've got to make sure that we've got the whole health and safety thing seriously under control so that everybody comes to work today actually goes home safely. So there's a bunch of things. So those 4 principles again: set direction, ensure capability, oversee performance, provide accountability. So they're the big 4. Notice all of they are what. They're not how. How is your practice? And so the way we put those into practice is where, I'll say complexity, but where difference comes in, because your company, my company, the next company, because we're in different contexts, the way we put it into practice changes.
Yeah, because we're at different phases. We're running different races.
That's it. And so if I take my health sector background, which is one of the areas I work in, if I take my health sector background and put it into a high-tech startup mode of operation, probably it's going to land with a bit of a clang.
And I guess, how do you suggest people navigate these kind of theologies of approach, practice, whatever? It reminds me of people that have a very strong affinity to one practice or of investing, whether it be quant-based investing, value investing, momentum investing, whatever. Often I see investors become married to their one principle and they live or die by that approach, rather than kind of seeing across the spectrum of principles or practices which you could gain some level of wisdom from, perhaps, because like you say, it's not one answer.
It's not one answer. But I like your use of the word theologies. You mentioned that on the way through. We grab onto things with almost theological fervor sometimes, and we just lock in on them. Usually, if we be gracious, usually when that happens, we've actually locked on a detailed practice. We've not actually locked on to the principles.
Right.
And so the problem becomes because let's say the maturity of the company changes, the marketplace changes, and therefore we've got to practice differently. We're now a fish out of water because we've been hanging on to the practice rather than taking the oversight principle. So how do we deal with that? we need to rediscover something that we do naturally as children. Now, I'm not saying that directors should be children.
Yeah.
But that, that innate curiosity, you remember that as a young kid?
Yep.
You were nosy.
I know it in my 3 kids, so
and you see it in your kids, right?
Now, yeah.
And I see it now in my grandchild.
Right.
Same thing, right? So we've got to nurture that as adults in the room. We've got to learn to ask. Our superpower as directors is the questions we ask, right? So to be able to load up some good probing questions. Okay. So are we doing what we said we would? Are we getting the results that we expected? Are we spending enough time strategizing? And, we're living in a completely dynamic world that,
full of a lot of noise.
There's a lot of noise, but there's also a lot of good stuff going on. And how do we separate between what's signal and what's noise? Yep. So I'll tell you how I do it. Okay. And I'm certainly not saying this is the be all and end all. And I'm not saying it's easy. So I'm the guy, remember I'm a farmer's son. So I get up when the sun gets up. At this time of the year, that's 5 o'clock in the morning or something stupid, right? So in general, I'll spend an hour and a half every morning while the house is quiet. Now, spoiler alert, we only have 2 in the house nowadays.
Right. Yeah.
But I'll spend an hour and a half from about 5:15 till about 6:45, 7 o'clock reading.
Cool.
Okay. I'll be looking at overnight news feeds. I'll be looking at the electronic, but the newspaper. I'll be catching up on emails, posts, other stuff. So what I'm doing is environment scanning, and I'll do that with a notepad or with my iPad pencil or whatever it is, just to sort of give me tidbits as to what's going on. Okay, 6 days a week. Now I'm doing that with speed reading to try and keep up. Okay. If I read all of that material in full, there's no, I'd drown. Okay, so we need to be a little bit ruthless about what we're reading, but equally we need to open our eyes because there's all these possibilities. Software engineer from way back, yes, but I'm not up to date with the modern AI, even though I studied AI in 1984 at university.
Yeah,
it's and so we need to open our minds. Okay, because we don't know all the answers, not at all. Yeah. Second thing I do in the evenings, usually for an hour or two, most evenings, 6-7 days, when we're out, but when we're at home together, is I'll read.
Yeah.
But wait a minute, you read in the morning. I'm reading differently. So I'm reading biographies, great leaders. I'm reading philosophy. I'm reading theology. You mentioned that before. But this is about pondering big questions, because what I'm looking for is examples of what's gone on in the past that might give me a clue for making sense of what's going on today and emerging.
Have you looked much into mimetic behavior?
No, but I know what you're talking about. I've got a shopping list of stuff that I could look at, but as you know, with 3 kids, there's only a certain number of hours in the day.
Yeah. So you're kind of using the morning for more micro, and then the macro timeless is kind of more in the evening. It's
more
almost
in the
timeless.
Evening.
It's like, hey, what are the rhymes of history? What can I take that's kind of timeless?
Yes, so that's really well summarized. And for different people with different biorhythms, different sense-making approaches, different times of the day will make sense. And so because I work globally as well, I've got evening commitments that could go as late as midnight because I'm doing a call somewhere else in the world, right? Advising, coaching, whatever. And so I'll have breaks during the day. I'm not 5 o'clock in the morning until midnight every day, not at all. And so I'm 50, 60 hours a week, like most busy leaders, is me. But it's in chunks because we need to rest and recover.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read into or looked or listened to Naval Ravikant at all.
Yeah, I know the name.
Yeah, he's got some he's like, he talks about how as an entrepreneur you need to kind of feast like a lion in a sense that you basically do, it's lots of sprints.
Yeah.
And then you kind of lull you
digest,
and then you go back again. Whereas, you can get trapped into obviously just this marathon, which is never ending, and your performance goes down dramatically, or which is unideal.
No, that's right. And we can go quite stale as a result, right? And so one of the things that I'm doing at the moment is I'm looking on my bookshelf, because I've got a physical bookshelf as well as what's sitting electronic.
Yeah.
And I'm going back and rereading stuff that I first read 10, 20, 30 years ago. And because I'd read it some time ago, I'm now discovering there's new insights available to me, which is fascinating.
I love that. I love when you go through something a second or third time and you pick something new out. There's nothing.
It's gold, eh?
Yeah.
It's really gold. What I usually do with my book, I don't mark my books. Some people do, I don't. But usually what I'm trying, because in the evening, it's hard copy. Not electronic.
Right, of course. Well, yeah.
And that's through the whole neuroscience about the way we consume information on screen versus paper, and what concentrates the mind and what moves the heart and all that sort of stuff. And so I'm trying to get my body to a place that when I put my head on the pillow, I actually go to sleep. Whereas what I find, like a lot of people, if I'm on my iPad or using the big computer screen, finish up, clean my teeth, go to bed.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is helpful for governance and leaders, but it gives you a sense of the sorts of things that I do, that I hear others do, who are looking to govern with impact.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, you've got to be well informed and not live by analogy. And the only way to do that is to really dig in a little bit.
You got to dig in, but as a leader, as a trusted advisor, as a confidant, we also need to have the credibility of doing it, not just talking about it. And so, I'm a serving company director. I've served on, 25 boards over the years across tech, across health, professional services, others, and family business, private. So it just gives that sense of, I wouldn't want to say I know what I'm talking about, but I know what the real word looks like because I've felt it.
So I guess perhaps something that's maybe not talked about a lot, and it could be potentially a tangent, but governance is often looked at, especially in high growth startups, big businesses, listed companies, etc., private equity, whatever. But then there's independent business owners that have grown something from nothing to $5 million, $10 million a year in revenue, and they're still the only shareholder. And also, how do we govern then? How do we learn from those principles for then governing our households? Because those are two subjects, and they're very much the thought that almost all of our audience will be thinking about as business owners, founders, and obviously often they are a part of a household that they are governing.
So let's take the business part first, right? And so if you've got a founder who's grown to 5 or 10 million and they are the primary or exclusive shareholder, they've been making all the big boys or big girls decisions, I will get asked, do we need governance?
Yeah.
And my answer is, well, not necessarily. Fascinating. Now, that's a bit of an outlier response, but when we talk about it, they go, oh, thank goodness. And what they're really concerned about is that they've been advised that they need to set up a board of directors. Spoiler alert, if it's a company, you've got a board, because board just means the group of directors.
That's right.
But the projection they've had on them is they need all this formality of a monthly meeting and all this reporting, but they're just trying to run the business, manage cash, and serve customers, right?
Yeah.
And so my response is very simple. If you own the business, if you're the director of the business, if you're the manager of the business, you don't need all of that formality, but there is some legal minimum, like you've got to put in a company's return and all that sort of stuff. If, however, you're looking to grow further, and or you don't necessarily want to make all the big decisions yourself, and or you lack some expertise to make good decisions, then it can be useful to get some other people around you, appoint them as directors, and then get the basics underway.
It's actually, for someone like that has grown something from 0 to 5 million and is still the shareholder, it's kind of like paying for insurance for yourself.
Bingo.
Right? Because
absolutely right.
You're the only shareholder, so you are who the board works for.
It's your baby, right? And so the board's got to look after the best interests of the company. We know that, and the company shares are sitting in the room beside us.
Yeah.
But actually there's this environment of trust and fiduciary, and how do we work together to make sure that we make good decisions so the company keeps going, because if the company keeps going, the shareholders win.
Yeah.
Right? And that's good.
Mm-hmm.
So let's now talk about family.
Yeah.
How do we govern the family? Press, rinse, and repeat on those 4 principles. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
So you got 3 kids?
Yep.
Partner?
Yep.
Great. So who decides what holidays you go on? You or we or she?
We make suggestions.
Okay, you chat about it. So think about, we're sitting in a boardroom, we've got some information and I'm just going to merge the 2 of them together.
Yeah.
I'd like to go away for a holiday.
Yeah.
Great. So we need to gather some information. We need to find out if we've got the resources to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Do we actually want to do it? And how does this fit in terms of our go forward plans?
Yeah, right.
All of that sounds remarkably
Yeah.
like set direction, roadmap, resources, doesn't it?
It does.
So same sort of thing. And so the governance of the Crow household, it's not Peter Crow's household.
Yeah, right.
I just happen to be the male in the house.
Yeah.
There's also Robin Crow, my wife, right? And with the kids, now when the kids are really small, we ran the show.
Yeah.
But as they grew up, the bigger we. And so there's this very important distinction, back to business now, but very important distinction between management and governance. So management, the manager makes the decision. Governance, the board or the collective makes the decision. Yeah. And we, so in my household, we make the big decisions together. And that's the equivalence, right? And so there are some guiding values and principles, and we don't talk about them that much because
they exist.
And not only that, they've existed and been practiced against for decades.
Yeah.
Since we've been married, right?
Yeah.
So, and we check in on stuff and we talk about our hopes and dreams and what's important to us and what's changing around us that we like or dislike, just like a good board would do over in business land.
Yeah, right.
So we talk about work-life balance. I see it more as work-life integration for that whole wealth creation agenda.
For sure. So I definitely agree with that. Did you look into what Berkshire did from a governance perspective at all? Have you perused down that rabbit hole?
Berkshire Hathaway, you mean?
Yeah.
No.
You haven't?
No, because he's sitting at the big end, so Warren Buffett and co, to the extent, and the reason I say no is I have not studied it closely.
Yeah.
Right? But what I have studied carefully is that he's very, very clear, like crystal clear on the North Star, right? Long-term, incremental business, and he's got basically a framing that a company needs to get through, a matrix, if you will, for him to invest and also for him to divest. So I've looked at it from that extent, and beyond that, I've not looked at it closely.
It's an interesting case study of, I guess, long-term governance through a pretty insular and initially group of shareholders that grew, right? It's potentially, I guess, got the most depth of content in terms of annual reports and writings that any one given company may have.
Yeah, and one of the distinctives that I'd highlight is that in the US, directors have to act in the best interest of shareholders first, whereas the rest of the world, we've got to act in the best interest of the company first. So there's an important distinction there.
That is interesting.
I was on stage in New York in July talking at an investor conference. So the International Corporate Governance Network, right? And investors there from BlackRock down.
Yeah.
So plenty of big boys there. And it was actually fascinating. They called it a keynote interview. You and I would have called it a fireside chat, but there you go. And there was a previous speaker who was an absolutely notable, whom I know and respect highly. And she had the stage and she was talking about the best interests of shareholders.
Right.
And in the US context, she's absolutely correct.
Right.
Half her audience was not US.
So they were a bit confused.
Well, I'm not sure they were confused. An opportunity presented itself for our conversation to just to draw that distinction. So this is where context matters. So yes, understanding the law is kind of important.
Yeah.
But what's more than that is we need to understand the operating context because it's moving around us all the time, right? Who knew about AI a decade ago? COVID comes, bang, now it's just a dot point in history, you know? And as directors and as boards, we need to have our eyes wide open. There will be disruptions. There is a long-term game. And so Berkshire Hathaway, others play the long game. And they communicate well with the companies they've invested in, with the annual letter, the Thanksgiving letter, Larry Fink, Warren Buffett, these guys. And it's about communication. It's absolutely fundamental. So tomorrow night, I'm sitting in a quarterly, or it's actually the half year as it comes out, but company for which I'm a director, and quarterly shareholder meetings. What's all that about? Tell them what's going on. Ask questions. Relationship. Make sure that we've still got their trust.
Yeah.
Because if we do things that they don't like, it's probably a dumb idea.
Yeah.
For example.
I think low expectations and strong communication pretty much is two good things to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think, our very biggest of companies like Fonterra, they do that pretty well. Xero over the years has done that really well since Roger set that up, a couple of decades ago now. Some do it less well. I think that, there's plenty of case studies for both good ways and less good ways. But, in the modern world, the default setting's got to be everybody knows. So don't try and hide stuff.
Yeah, that's for sure. Hey, so have you looked or delved into the world of DAOs?
No.
I won't double click there then. Because obviously with your background in software engineering and then governance, DAOs are very interesting from that kind of perspective, right? Conceptually, obviously in practice it's a different thing. Really, it's a digital way to kind of govern with true transparency. Which doesn't necessarily need an asset to speculate around. But it's a way that you could. It's like maybe we should have voting through real ID and online. Maybe that would be a sensible way to do things because it's a bit more efficient. And maybe we could in the future do a lot more governance through technology, perhaps. But obviously, I guess your point is that governance isn't really about technology. It's about the behaviors within the board.
Correct. And so we can use technology to streamline some stuff because we've got so much stuff coming at us now that we need to try and make sense of it. So, whether it's AI tools, Henry Ford, automation, production line, completely transformed the price of motor vehicles and the availability of cars with the Model T, right? So that for that era was the AI that we've got today. So we've got this technology that can look back, go through, I don't know how many untold transactions and work out what the next word should be, LLMs, and all sorts of other stuff. So that can be really helpful for managers making sense and writing information to boards. When I'm sitting before a board meeting, I read something in a report and I want to check, I can ask a question electronically. So AI can help me with that. Tick. But what about accountability? What about responsibility? What happens if the AI is in the room and contributes to a decision and it's wrong? Who do we blame? So I'm in that group of people that say governance decision-making, board decision-making should be with humans. The law supports me, but that we can use technology to great effect to speed up that understanding and processing. But we need to watch out for reasoning, intuition, sense-making, much of which is a human activity. Now, I might be proven wrong in a decade's time or 2 decades' time or never or next week. I'm open for that possibility. But for what I can see in front of me at the moment, that's where I'm sitting.
And I guess just to end then, what is the greatest example of an awesome example of governance? Doesn't have to be a board. I guess it would potentially naturally go down there. But what is who's your goat of governance?
I point to the doyens, right? So the 5 big guys that started off using the words, and I've been fortunate enough to sit at their feet I knew 4 of them, a couple of deceased now. But in terms of the real go-tos, the big ones tend to be in the UK, South Africa, the US. And so I look to people like Bob Garrett and Bob Tricker. I look at some that nobody on this broadcast would really know of, because the really good guys tend to be less visible. Here in New Zealand, I look to one name in particular. He's not governing now, but a gentleman called Brian Rhodes.
Okay.
So Brian had a big career. He worked with the Institute directors, which is where I met him, and we did some training together, delivered training together. But he was on Ngāi Tahu's seafood, fishing, all this sort of stuff. But nobody's ever heard of him, because what he understood was that the job of the board is to make these decisions so the vision cast of the chief executive can lead well. The job of the board is not to be the primary go-to person. The other one in modern context is Pete McBride, who chairs Fonterra.
Right.
You know, I looked at him and Miles, and sorry, I'm using their first names, but to what they've achieved in the current generation of leadership is simply outstanding for New Zealand Inc.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it.
Good.
I've learned a lot, so thank you so much.
No problem.
Thanks,
Thank
Peter.
you.